London, autumn, 1837. It was a time of huge social and political change. The Victorian era had just begun with the ascension of the young Queen to the throne. The new Metropolitan Police Service was still in its infancy, having been formed by Sir Robert Peel and the Duke of Wellington only 8 years earlier. Workhouses were being built all over England to cope with the poverty that plagued the country, and there were protests and riots everywhere. And it was against this background of upheaval and turmoil that a strange and bizarre legend began. From the long shadows of the backstreets of London he emerged. A tall, cloaked figure, leaping over buildings and hopping on rooftops and spitting flames at anyone he encountered, before disappearing back into the shadows again. But this was no urban myth. This is the true story of Spring-Heeled Jack. The first sightings occurred near the old cemetery on Barnes Common, Middlesex, on the outskirts of London. The common was already a dangerous place and was generally avoided by anyone but those who had business in the area. In late September 1837, a man returning home from work one night decided to take a shortcut through the common when he saw what looked like, in his own words, the devil himself in the graveyard beyond the railings. He immediately turned and ran. The following evening, as dusk was falling, 3 young ladies were accosted by the fiend as they made their way back home by the cemetery. He grabbed them and tore at their garments before bounding away back into the darkness. In the weeks that followed, it continued to menace people around the cemetery and the lanes of the common. As winter approached, it took to scaring people in the long, dark laneway known as Cutthroat Lane in Clapham Common. It was here that he attacked a young lady named Mary Stevens as she was on her way to work. Her screams alerted a group of men in a building nearby, and the assailant retreated back into the shadows. She said that a tall, shadowy figure had leapt over the wall in a single bound and had grabbed her. Coachmen also seemed to be a favourite ambush target for the devilish figure, who would leap over the walls and terrify their horses as they passed. One coachman and his footman were badly injured when their horses bolted after the creature jumped from behind a wall high into the air and over to the other side in the lane in front of them. All its victims described a tall, cloaked figure that wore a hideous mask with a hat or a helmet and long, high-heeled boots. Some said it had a prominent nose and flaming eyes. They also described the impossible heights he was able to jump and the fire he sometimes breathed from his mouth. And when he grabbed his victims and tore at their clothing, they swore they could feel metal claws. His feet made a dull thud as they hit the ground, and the footprints they left indicated some sort of spring-loaded mechanism in the boots. They also spoke of his weird, ringing laughter as he disappeared back into the night. And the attacks continued. Moving further afield to Dulwich and Camberwell, he attacked another 3 women, tearing at their clothing as they tried to run. In Tootingbeck Common one foggy evening, he followed a woman as she returned home from a gypsy encampment where she had been delivering food. But her screams were heard from the camp, and a group of gypsy men chased him away, where he disappeared into the mist. In Foster Hill, he ambushed a couple who were out for a stroll and almost blinded the woman as he spat fetid flames into their faces. All attempts to catch him so far had failed, and tales of the leaping devil were spreading fast throughout the towns and villages outside London, but none of these encounters had reached the newspapers yet, and that would soon change. It was a sunny evening on the 11th of October 1837, and the Blackheath Fair was in full swing. It was a famous yearly carnival of entertainment and sideshows, food and ale, which always drew crowds in from all over the country. Polly Adams, a young barmaid who worked in the Green Man Inn at Greenwich Reach, had been given the evening off to attend the fair. As dusk fell with a cold mist, she began to make her way back to the inn, down past Shooter's Hill and away from the twinkling lights of Blackheath. Shuddering, she nervously passed the hangman's gibbet of Greenwich Reach as it swayed and creaked in the chill night air. And then she saw it. Ahead of her in the distance under the moonlight, she could see the silhouette of a strange caped figure leaping high into the air as it approached, covering huge distances with each leap. Frozen with fear, she stood rooted to the spot as the figure suddenly landed straight in front of her and spat a fireball of flame straight into her face and began tearing at her clothing with its sharp claws. The terrified young woman fell to the ground, and as she lost consciousness, the devil figure bounded away off into the moonlight again, laughing maniacally as it went. Now the fiend was in London, and the papers finally took notice. The legend of Spring-Heeled Jack was born. It was a fresh January morning at the Mansion House when the Lord Mayor made an announcement to the hushed and nervous crowd in the Common Hall. He had received an anonymous letter about the leaping menace. The letter described how some individuals from the highest ranks of life had conspired to frighten 7 people to insanity or death as a wager, and that the wager had been accepted by one of them. Wearing the disguise of a ghost, a bear, or a devil, he would then prowl the streets of London looking for victims. The letter went on to detail that the villain had already driven 7 women insane with fright and had terrified one servant girl so badly that she would shriek at any man she encountered. Two other ladies had yet to recover from their encounters with the miscreant, and the writer implored the mayor to do whatever he could to put a stop to this madness. After finishing the letter, which was signed "A Resident of Beckham," the mayor tried to assure the crowd that the police would deal with it. But the crowd was frightened. Whatever it was seemed to have superhuman abilities and was able to attack and disappear at will. They weren't convinced that it was some elaborate prank. People began to stay indoors after dark unless they had business to deal with. Vigilante groups began to organise and patrol the streets of London at night. Admiral Sir Edward Codrington wrote to the Lord Mayor shortly afterwards and set up a reward fund for the capture of the Leaping Devil. He himself donated £100 towards it. Even the Duke of Wellington, the man who had defeated Napoleon, began to patrol every night on horseback with a loaded gun by his side, hoping to bag the fiend. But the Springhalt continued to evade them, and as he escaped he would sometimes taunt them by calling out, "The day is yours, leave the night to me," and his reign of terror continued. Such was the panic that sometimes policemen were mistaken for the fiend with their cloaks and top hats, and some were even chased down and attacked by groups of vigilantes. Not long afterwards, copycats began to emerge, causing even more confusion and a bigger headache for the authorities. The army was soon called in to help, and an entire battalion was commissioned to join the hunt, which made his next move even more brazen. In Colchester, a platoon was getting ready for departure overseas when he terrified them by leaping into the grounds of the barracks and scattering the frightened squaddies who fled in all directions. The army tried to keep the story quiet, mainly to save face. The leaping devil was even seen bounding the streets of Jacob's Island, a place where few people, even the police, dared to go. Known as the cholera capital of London, Jacob's Island was a notorious shantytown of hovels and slums, surrounded by a fetid canal of stinking, muddy water. As Jack hopped and leaped along the squalid streets, nobody dared confront him, not even hardened criminals, who all steered clear of him. The fiend, known as Spring-Heeled Jack, was clearly afraid of nothing and no one. It was now the middle of winter, and there was no sign of the capture of the fiend. Night fell with a tense darkness over the city, as Big Ben stood guard like a giant lighthouse over the Thames. And as the clock struck midnight, London settled into another uneasy slumber. In Beerbent Cottage, East London, the Alsop family was resting at home when their peace was suddenly broken by a loud and urgent ringing at the door. When young Jane Alsop answered the door saying, "Please don't ring so loud, what's the matter?" a dark silhouette in the laneway shouted, "I'm a policeman. For God's sake, bring me a light. We've caught Spring-Heeled Jack in the lane." Jane immediately turned and ran inside to grab a candle as she told her sisters Jack had been caught. Rushing back to the door, she handed the candle to the man outside and was horrified to find herself face to face with Spring-Heeled Jack as he threw his cloak aside. Spitting blue and white flames into her face, he pushed his way inside and began tearing at her gown with his claws. One of her sisters wrenched her away from his grasp, though he scratched and cut both of them quite badly with his claws, before fleeing when they started calling out for the police. The following week, Jack knocked on the door of a Mr. Ashworth in Turner Street, just off Commercial Road. A servant boy answered the door, and Jack, semi-visible in the shadows, asked to speak to the master of the house. But as the boy turned, he noticed the claw-like hands on the figure as it moved in the shadows, and he knew it was Jack. Turning on his heels, the boy screamed blue murder as he ran to get help, and Jack fled once again into the night. The boy said afterwards that he had noticed an ornate crest on the fold of the cloak, emblazoned with the letter W. Jack continued to evade all attempts at capture. But then suddenly in 1838, at the height of the panic he had caused in London and beyond, the demon leaper known as Spring-Heeled Jack disappeared as quickly and mysteriously as he had appeared. There were no more sightings and no more attacks. He simply vanished, and he still remains an enigma to this day. So who was Spring-Heeled Jack? There are a few theories, but most people, even back then, seem to have agreed that there was nothing paranormal or ghostly about the leaping dervish. And many suspected that Jack was an elaborate prank being played by a wealthy nobleman with the help of his friends. The anonymous letter sent to the Mayor of London in 1837 seemed to support this. One strong theory put forward by the author Peter Haining was that Spring-Heeled Jack was the Marquis of Waterford, a wealthy young man who was born into the landed gentry in Ireland. Waterford was well known for his pranks and hijinks. He was also a fitness fanatic and a very athletic young man with a sturdy frame and a stormy temper. Well known for accepting wagers on bets and for his cruel and outrageous pranks, he was also known to be a violent individual who enjoyed starting fights and getting into brawls. This was typical of that generation who had been born into massive wealth in Ireland. They were, after all, the sons and grandsons of military men who had been granted large tracts of land after the invasion of Ireland. Ireland, and to a large extent England, was their playground, and few of them ever faced consequences. These sons of lords and ladies were literally above the law. But not everywhere. It was during a holiday trip to Bergen that Waterford finally came across someone who was not willing to tolerate his shenanigans. Out on a drunken night with a young lady, he was challenged by a local constable who was angered by his behaviour. The constable cracked the young lord across the head with his staff and began to savagely beat him with it. The head blow, severe enough to have pierced his temple to the bone, left him with serious concussion and facing a month of recovery. His friends lodged a complaint with the British consulate, but to no avail given his reputation. Far away from home and the influence of his family, there was little he or his friends could do, and the sombre party returned to England as soon as he was well enough to travel. But in the months that followed, the blow to his skull seemed to have affected him beyond his injured pride, and even appeared to affect his reason at times. His friends noticed how his practical jokes became darker and crueler, his wagers and pranks became more dangerous, and he began to show a reckless disregard for his own safety. They noticed a darkness in his demeanour too, which only lifted when he was challenged to a wager, and this may have given birth to the wager that the anonymous writer referred to in their letter to the Lord Mayor. According to Peter Haining, logs of the day did confirm that Waterford was in many of the areas where the attacks occurred at the times that they occurred. So how did he do it? Waterford's family held a vast amount of wealth. It would have been very easy for him to afford the work of a good engineer, and one of those engineers may even have been within his close circle of friends. From the footprints he left behind and from the witnesses who saw them, it was clear that there was some sort of machinery attached to his boots. The mask and cloak would have been easier still, and the fire breathing could have been a circus trick he had learned, using alcohol as fuel, and Waterford and his friends were never far away from alcohol. His ability to disappear from an area altogether suggests he did have help. A waiting horse or a carriage could easily have been arranged for him, and if there had been a wager between them, they were already involved. At some stage, he and his friends decided to stop. Either things had gotten too hot for them, or the wager had been satisfied. The rumours, even at the time amongst high society, was that Waterford was behind the criminal hoax. We can also recall the servant boy who had answered the door to Jack and who noticed the W crest on Jack's cloak. The initial could have stood for Waterford. So what about Sir Robert Peel and the Duke of Wellington, the men who had created the Metropolitan Police Force? Surely they were aware of the rumours about the young lord. In fact, both of them knew Waterford and his family very well, and if they were aware of the rumours, they didn't seem to be concerned about them. In fact, both of them had recommended Waterford for the position of Keeper of the Queen's Hounds. So certainly he had a high enough reputation to recommend him as carer of the royal canines. As it happened, Waterford politely, graciously turned down the offer. But that all being said, the claims of his involvement were just claims, and they were never proven. But there is a strong case that the Marquis of Waterford was Spring-Heeled Jack. Waterford eventually married and settled down to a quiet life on his estate. On March 29, 1859, he was killed in a hunting accident in Curragmore, Ireland, when his horse had tripped over a small fence and the young lord was thrown headfirst off his steed. The impact broke his neck and he died almost immediately. Oddly, sporadic sightings of Spring-Heeled Jack continued to be reported well into the 20th century, and there was even one alleged sighting of him as late as 2012. But the laughing villain himself remained uncaptured as he leaped and laughed and bounded his way into the pages of history and folklore. And to this day, Admiral Codrington's reward for the capture of Spring-Heeled Jack remains still unclaimed. Good night, wherever you are.